Welcome to our webinar, Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. We are excited to have you all join us in join us today in our second of a series of webinars related to our book. My name is Martha Matsuoka. I'm on the faculty of Urban and Environmental Policy at Occidental College, where I direct the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute, an applied research and community engaged program center on campus. I'm joined today with my friend and co-author Chad Raphael from Santa Clara University, along with chapter co-authors Sarah Commodore, Indiana University, Bloomington School of Public Health, and Ryan Petteway, Oregon Health and Science University and Portland State University School of Public Health. And in absentia, though with us in spirit is David Rebanal, with the Department of Public Health, San Francisco State University, who unfortunately couldn't join us in our webinar today. Today, I'll start off with a brief overview of the goals of the book. Chad will follow me with an overview of the book's contents. Then he'll turn it over to Sarah and Ryan to present on their chapters on research methods and then public health. We invite all of you to post questions using the Q&A button throughout the webinar today, and we'll respond to the questions after the presentations. As you know, the webinar is recorded, and we will email you the link after the webinar. Okay, so here's our series that we're now in the second of, and you'll see that there are two others subsequent to today. If you follow that QR code at the bottom, it'll take you to our registration page, and we encourage you to register for all of the series. To the right is the QR code for our book. Of course, it's downloadable, so if you just go to the QR code, you'll be able to easily access the book. So our book had four overarching goals. The first was to develop a volume with a focus specifically on community engaged research for environmental justice and how we can conduct more of it and how we can do better. We knew there were many excellent books on community engaged research and also environmental justice. We also recognized that there were many empirical articles using community engaged research for EJ, but no single volume that synthesized the community engaged research approach for environmental justice. So we wanted to fill this gap and show how we could conduct more community engaged research for environmental justice and how we can do it better. We wanted to focus on our primary audience of professional researchers in academia, government, advocacy organizations, some of whom work or have worked as research in community organizations. It was a particular audience, but we knew there were excellent resources available that had been written by community partners for a community level audience, and our role was to speak to professional researchers to do more and to do better. Secondly, we wanted to demonstrate how community engaged research advances environmental justice, and we saw this in four ways. First was by centering local knowledge. Secondly, building truth from the ground up. Thirdly, producing actionable data that can influence decisions. And then importantly, transforming researchers' relationships to communities for equity and mutual benefit. Our third goal was to establish a justice framework on how community engaged research and environmental justice align on concepts of justice and how these concepts apply in various fields of urban planning, public health, conservation, law and policy, community economic development, and food justice and sovereignty. Our fourth goal was to involve multiple perspectives and fields. Chad and I each brought our own experiences and disciplinary perspectives to the book project, and we recognize that knowledge is situated in our individual perspectives and experience, but also produced through relations with others, because anyone can contribute to research, but none can produce it alone. We knew that we needed additional perspectives beyond our own and more collective authorship. So we reached out to early career Black, Indigenous, and scholars of color who were doing community engaged research in their respective fields and invited them to co-author chapters with us. And we're thrilled to have them here today on this webinar. Also to note, we wanted to create a book that was widely accessible, so we opted for an ebook, downloadable for free. Again, go to that QR code and download the book. So I will turn it now over to Chad, who will talk a little bit about the contents of the book. Chad.
Thanks so much, Martha. If you want to pop forward to the next slide, that'd be great. The book in part one establishes the foundations for the book by defining and describing the development of environmental justice and community engaged research. It shows why they're especially well suited to each other, and it offers a current summary of the major literature on both topics. We introduce a framework that we use throughout the book, focused on how researcher-community collaborations can advance 4 dimensions of justice that are common to community-engaged research and environmental justice. Moving to part two addresses how community-engaged researchers can collaborate with community partners to co-construct knowledge about environmental justice. So there's a chapter that summarizes the preparatory work and the self-analysis that outside researchers need to do before partnering with EJ communities to address power imbalances and bridge differences. Chapter 4 describes how researchers and community partners can collaborate with each other and address power relations in each of the major stages and elements of CER work, from sharing funding to co-disseminating findings and taking action. And then chapter 5 addresses the barriers to conducting this kind of research within higher education and how they might be dismantled. Moving to part 3, this part really explores the ways that community-engaged research has been applied to EJ across disciplines. Each chapter presents an overview of community-engaged research in this domain, some exemplary case studies, and some directions for future research. The part begins with the chapter that Ryan and Sarah are going to present today, which summarizes the range of research methods and methodologies that are most often employed in community-engaged research for EJ. Subsequent chapters explore how this research has contributed to EJ in law, policy, regulation, and public participation, community economic development, public health, which Ryan is also going to present today, food justice and food sovereignty, urban and regional planning, and conservation and restoration. Going on to the next slide, we'll let you know what we're going to do today. Today, we're presenting material from 2 chapters of the book. Ryan and Sarah are going to present first on methods and methodology, then Ryan on public health. Again, please post those questions that you have throughout in the using the Q&A button, and we'll respond to as many as we can after the presentations. The webinar is also being recorded, and we'll email a link to you after this recording today. Let me introduce Ryan and Sarah and David, who's not with us. Sarah Commodore is an assistant professor of environmental and occupational health at the Indiana University Bloomington School of Public Health. Her research interests include using multidimensional data to examine susceptibility to disease and leveraging that knowledge to inform public health interventions. Her environmental justice research focuses especially on inequitable exposure to particulate matter and carbon monoxide, and she's co-authored a review of the literature on community-engaged research on air pollution. Ryan Petteway, who co-authored both chapters being presented today, is an associate professor at Oregon Health and Science University and Portland State University School of Public Health. His research integrates social epidemiology, participatory research, and creative arts to advance health equity. He engages critical Black feminist and decolonizing theory and methods to pursue procedural and epistemic justice within public health research and practice, including via music and poetry. Dr. Petteway also served as social epidemiologist and chief epidemiologist at the Baltimore City Health Department. And then David, who can't be with us because he's teaching today, is an associate professor of public health in the College of Health and Social Sciences at San Francisco State University. He's also an affiliate faculty member at the San Francisco State Health Equity Institute. He conducts epidemiological research and mixed methods evaluations focused on building evidence for policy and population-level interventions aimed at social and political determinants of racial health inequities. Dr. Rebanal has nearly 2 decades of public health experience, including working in public health program development and evaluation, in philanthropy, policy advocacy, and community-based participatory research initiatives. So I'm going to ask Martha to stop sharing her screen. We'll invite Ryan and Sarah to share their slides and begin with their first presentation.
Thank you so much, Chad and Martha, for the warm introduction. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar with us today. Thank you, Ryan. Such an honor to co-author with Ryan and Martha and Chad. Just good afternoon to everyone whose afternoon time it is, and then morning to anyone who's like about 5 hours difference from the New York time zone. Quickly, I will start and I will talk about just three of our methods that we talk about in this chapter. And then I'll hand over to our gracious co-author, Ryan, to take charge of the rest of it and then continue with the presentation. So if you don't mind, Ryan, go ahead and switch it out. So these are the methods we'll highlight today. Feel free to go through the book and see specifics of how we weave all these different methodologies into the CJ for CER work. Next slide, please. So before I talk about just those three main methods, I would really like to hone in on something here. I believe Chad said that for the very first webinar, that research justice is not guaranteed simply by choosing the right method, right? It depends on how it's applied and what comes out of it. And the main spotlight that he's honed on a few times are just the different dimensions, that 4 different dimensions of justice and what that looks like. And eventually we want transformation, right? We want recognition, we want procedural justice, and then also distributive justice. And I'm trying to bring your attention to this as we talk about all these different methodologies. Next slide, please. So surveys, that's the first one. And if we move on to the next slide, I'd like to focus on how a community have used this to their advantage. Here in the picture that you're seeing in this before slide is a community gathering that a group had where they're doing indoor air measurements of particulate matter, carbon monoxide. They're doing different types of measurements, personal measurements. But it was quite interesting that if you didn't put these women together, and the object was just to be able to see what they were experiencing in their homes in terms of smoke, because this setting is in South America, it's in Peru. We're talking about cold temperatures because this is the Black Andes. It doesn't snow there, but it's just as cold. And if you want their buy-in, there's a reason why they're keeping their stoves inside their homes. They need the warmth. They need that heat. They have little children with them constantly. And so we might be worried about the smoke, you know, depending on where you're coming from, if you're a toxicologist or you're an inhalation, you know, expert. But they're also concerned about the heat. And there are other things where if you don't align their needs with the kind of research that you're doing, you're going to just get this whole thing wrong. This picture is actually one that worked because once the women were in there, one of them was very super, what do you say? She was so outgoing that once she decided to take this on and work on this project, it became successful for the whole project. And what happened was they took a stove that they were using, and then they went on and gave them a new stove. If you wanted them to use the brand new stove, they had to have the community's buy-in. Then they went ahead and did a survey where they asked them. In here on this slide in the after, you can see a control, and then you can see intervention. So intervention is whenever they were given a new stove. And for the most part, anytime they were having the control stove, they tended to have more respiratory symptoms. And then whenever there was an intervention stove, it was actually lower. But they knew they had this all the time, but if they did not get their buy-in to even use the intervention stove, there was a problem. And this study was quite important for eventually, I think they went back to Africa, they went to Nepal, they went to different places where they were able to help with adherence, because you could give someone a new stove, and if you didn't have the community buy-in, the new stove would be sitting there, nobody would use it. So it was really important to get that insider perspective and get their buy-in before going on to it. So that's just one way of highlighting that it's not the right methodology, it's not the wrong methodology, but the most important thing was that the community input there made that difference for other people to also get this kind of intervention. Next slide, please. So another method I would like to highlight is just environmental monitoring. And in this case, again, another case study to be presented here, but I I want to give you a little idea of what was happening in this case. This is Charleston, South Carolina, and it's like the peninsula, this little graph that you've seen at the bottom of the map. It's a very expensive neighborhood. Most of the houses are over 1 million, but right next across them, there's just the river that was separating them. There was a paper mill, and it smelled so badly every time they would work and work. We all need paper for printing everything, but it was very bad. Some of the people were complaining that they were sick. Right in this neighborhood, if I had showed you a different graph, you see that most of the people who lived here were actually Black and poor, and the people who lived here were actually rich and a different race. And so everybody was suffering, but it took the rich people here to actually start making a lot of noise. And eventually they enlisted some people to do air monitoring for them. Go ahead and give me the after slide. So in this air monitoring, they actually took particulate matter, so it was PM 2.5 measurements. And there was a community worker who said, well, I'd like to document on the days that it smells really, really bad and on the days that I don't smell anything. And they took this data and they mapped it to whenever there was nothing smelling bad. And it didn't matter whether you were on this super expensive island or you were on the other island where everybody, the other side of the peninsula where everybody lived. And then they showed, if you can see here, no, it's this blue is whenever it was like a regular place, it was like an offsite place where it was a hospital, everybody went there. This is where the paper mill was smelling, it smells downstream from where they were. And every time they were actually able to show when they collected the community data that when it was a yes and the smell was very bad, the PM levels were actually high. It wasn't as high as what the US EPA would currently, regulate, because they just recently reduced their level, but it was still to the point that was bothering them. And then I think there's one more click. And eventually they actually shut down. The owner cited that he didn't have the money to run it anymore, but apparently there's been a lot of pressure because it really smelled bad. And this is a tourist site. There are a lot of things, but it was quite interesting that in this case, you wouldn't think of the traditional EJ work as a very rich neighborhood, but they had input. Those that were regular economically distressed also had input, because some of the air monitors were placed there. But eventually, all that community data came together, and then right now there's release. So there's no rotten egg smell anymore. So just one way of, again, getting community input and using actually their data to solve a problem that was, a problem for everyone. But eventually it was their input with the yes and no, because every time they would complain and say, oh, but we don't have anything to prove. We couldn't document when it was smelling and when it wasn't smelling. Finally, somebody took it on themselves to do this, and it worked well. So next slide, please. So here's this community worker who decided to just work on it. And then this was their site that they used for the normal one where it was just not a lot of pollution. And this was actually a MLS, so a Major League Soccer stadium that had power that this community could plug in their monitor in and be able to measure. But it worked well for getting downstream measurements for it. But the data was actually key. It seemed so simple, but it was key. Yes, today there was order. No, tomorrow it was just smelling normal. But it was just the key for them to be able to present to a lot of authorities. Next slide, please. And these two people were actually quite phenomenal in explaining some of that data. They suggested there was a lot of wind patterns that were going on there. And so that made a big difference. And that rotten egg smell was total reduced sulfate. But eventually, everybody came to the agreement that this was undesirable. Whether you're super rich or you're super poor, you just don't want this extra smell, extra burden on you. And it's just something that I just wanted to highlight as community coming together, again, to make a difference. And thankfully, right now, this paper mill is not even they're not functioning anymore. they're getting ready to pull down everything and not operate there in that space anymore. Next slide, please. The last one before I turn over to Ryan here is just about biomonitoring. And this is a very interesting angle for this case study that I would like to present. So you can type different types of biological data, right? You can take urine, blood. Thankfully, with COVID now, everybody's okay with taking nasal pharyngeal swabs. You can do all kinds of things. But here, I'd like to highlight this because this is something that's a thorny political issue right now. And it has to do with risk and resiliency at the US-Mexico border. I actually have a colleague in our School of Public Health, Dr. Del Rio, who has explained a lot of this in interesting ways, understanding the background in some of these communities. I wanted to specifically highlight a study that came from the El Paso School District. So they took a lot of fourth graders, fifth graders, different types of children who you could do lung function measurements with. And so the biological monitor here was just their lung function, but it was quite key. If you don't mind moving to the next slide. So eventually, some of this data have come in and informed some of how the US Census Bureau actually sees resiliency, and they measure risk and resiliency. And what is this graph at the bottom saying? Here, they measured these children and they divided them up, excuse me. And at the bottom here, I apologize for the small font here, but basically anything at 0 means that there was no change in the child's lung function. If it's below 0 and it's negative, it means the child had reduced lung function. If it's above this line, the child had, improved lung function. And this right here is the one that was very troubling. And it's anytime there were cockroaches and there were no pesticides used in that home for any of those fifth graders and fourth graders, their risk for asthma was increased, or just even a negative lung function. And this school district, it was just down right here. And it's on the US side, but they didn't understand why some of the risk factors were just super high for asthma, for different types of health outcomes, hypertension, whatever you call it. But for this, it was childhood asthma. And it was quite interesting that you could look at this, get the parents buy-in. It's okay to have them measure your child's lung function, report the data back to the physician and to the parents, and then they could see if they can do something about it. Can we just introduce some kind of biologically safe pesticide for that child in their home, kill whatever it is that's causing the allergen, and then making that child to react and have whatever it is that allergic sensitivity. It's just one way of using data to inform a group of people who may not otherwise have the opportunity to speak. But if you go into their homes and you're interacting with parents and you're explaining what is happening to them, this data can actually, it was published and I believe it was used for something good, but it was exciting to see that the Census Bureau is actually highlighting different things of how they're getting some of their risk and resiliency index and trying to find who's more vulnerable in those communities and trying to help them. Hopefully this data will help, but that's one way we can create justice, right? Research justice with some of the work that we do. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ryan. Thank you so much for your time and I look forward to the questions.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Let's move right along here since a lot of methods to talk about. So I'm going to talk about community mapping, storytelling, participatory media, community arts and photo voice, and big data and small data. I'm going to move pretty quickly through these. I won't be going into detailed case studies just as there's too many methods. And I think that the best use of the time is probably just to give like an overview and refer you back to the chapter and the examples that we cite within the chapter itself. So community mapping, I think that this is kind of foundational, right? I think at the end of the day, we're talking about locations and places in which we are exposed to good things or negative things. Most of the work that we're going to do for environmental justice is going to involve some type of use of maps. We have to be able to figure out where the things are and where people are in relation to those things, right? And there's a lot of work in this area. So I'm going to talk about GIS and participatory GIS and qualitative GIS and counter mapping here. And very quickly, I won't spend too much time going over what GIS is, Geographic Information Systems. I assume at this point, most folks that would be on this webinar are familiar with GIS in a general sense, right? But in terms of mapping, there's a lot of reasons why we've engaged mapping and use mapping and why mapping is so core. There's just a list of things here for you to kind of breeze through real quick. I think for me, what I would suggest is that if we're able to visually, represent information by using maps, I think that helps to streamline the process and more efficiently communicate information. I think for our purposes when we do EJ work, and how we use those maps, it varies. I think that the broader organizing concepts for this book, in terms of distributive justice and procedural justice, and especially epistemic justice in terms of recognition, maps can be used to tell stories about places and spaces of people's community experiences, right? And those maps can be contested, and they often are continually contested, right? And so if we're not mapping our own data, then somebody's mapping our data for us, or they're mapping their data about us, right? And so I think the ways in which we think about mapping are inextricably linked to our ability to either resist and counter the narratives about EJ in our communities, or to basically just to create our own evidence to push back, or to allow somebody else to kind of control that narrative, essentially. So move on from there and get us into. Let me organize my screen here a bit. In terms of participatory GIS, the idea here with GIS, this could be done by anybody. Oftentimes, people just download data from the internet. They start mapping things. You can get on the internet right now and go to the Census Bureau and have a map right there that's data that you didn't create, that you had no control of shaping. Oftentimes, we use some of those data in our own research, for example, for getting population denominators by things like census tracts or zip codes sometimes. But with participatory GIS, the idea is that you really want to center the control over what's going on in terms of data measurement and collection and analysis, but for the folks that are actually living in and experiencing what's going on in particular communities, right? And so as we cite in our chapter here, the Hackley and Francis piece, the idea here is that there's an explicit attempt to use these mapping technologies to amplify, what's going on in communities, right? And so I think that, with GIS, you're just trying to it's almost as if we assume that it's neutral. Like the data's here, we have data, let's share the data and walk away. With participatory GIS, there's really nothing neutral about it. There's an intention there, and I think that because we're talking about place and space and justice, it's inherently political, right? And so participatory GIS really wants to be able to lift up and serve as an instrument to kind of communicate that element of space and place. With qualitative GIS, same thing with participatory GIS. I think that the major difference for this particular approach is that it affords an opportunity to put things within maps and embed things in maps, especially within digital mapping for GIS, that are not necessarily going to be like empirical, right? In terms of numbers. Oftentimes we want to take, air quality, we do biomonitoring, we collect water samples, and we embed that data onto a map. And that's great. Oftentimes, that form of data or evidence is useful for advancing certain claims and affecting certain folks who are willing to listen to that type of data. Other times, you need qualitative data, right? So what Sarah was talking about in terms of the smell, how do you measure smell, right? How do you read smell? Is there a number for a smell? There's not, right? And so I'm sure there is. Actually, I shouldn't quote me on that. I'm trying to, there's probably some science about smell. So, but what I'm getting at here is that, like, if you have a compelling story in a narrative, a geo-narrative, for example, or a geoethnography, or a walk-along interview by that paper mill that tells people's experiences and what they're smelling and experiencing in a way that can be embedded and uploaded into that map. It adds a different layer and a different level of affectual response and emotional connection and some element of viscerality to the map that otherwise would be absent, right? And so it could be something about smell, it could be something about how people feel in certain places, right? So oftentimes we want to do like biomonitoring to measure people's cortisol levels about how they experience stress. Well, sometimes it's just better to let folks tell you what their body's feeling in those places, right? And sometimes that form of data or evidence is going to be more impactful or influential within policy conversations or motivating social action, right? So the idea of qualitative GIS is that you want to think about ways in which we could advance our environmental justice stories by not necessarily tying ourselves to the standard status quo. Let's take a water sample, let's take air quality, let's map it out, and there we go, right? Because even if that is participatory, with participatory GIS, for example, having folks in the community walk around and take air measurements themselves and analyze data themselves, that's great, but there's also another way in which we could tell that story, and sometimes qualitative GIS is the missing piece. Together with these, and I should mention at the top here, these methods are not necessarily used in isolation, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So you can do participatory GIS and qualitative GIS quite a bit, right? And together, using those methodological orientations are most often what we find with this idea of counter mapping, which is mapping that is essentially intentionally trying to disrupt and challenge dominant representations or expressions of data that we have in terms of EJ communities. As we cite in the chapter, oftentimes it's the word itself, the phrase itself, counter mapping is often used in terms of indigenous communities and under an orientation of decolonization and resisting encroachment upon natural habitats and ecological systems and preventing disruption to ecological systems, right? But that orientation very much applies itself to pretty much anything we can imagine under the EJ umbrella, right? There's oftentimes competing narratives about what's going on in communities. Oftentimes there's missing data, missing in quotes here. So oftentimes we have to go out and find our own ways to collect data for ourselves to tell a story, right? The burden of proof on EJ communities is it's always there. And so counter mapping is a way in which we could place things on a map that were systematically excluded from the maps that were created by outside communities or organizations or companies, et cetera. So we can put things on the map, or we can challenge what's been shared within existing mapping, within maps that are existing within that conversation. And so, and again, none of these are separate from one another, and they can all be used in aggregate, as I'll describe in a few minutes here. So going into storytelling, and again, you can use qualitative GIS and participatory GIS and counter mapping as a part of your storytelling, right? But within this part of what we try to shape for this part of the chapter, we really want to focus on digital storytelling, oral histories, and counter storytelling. Digital storytelling, as it sounds like, is essentially using various methodologies that we've already talked about here, including the ones that Sarah went over. So you can combine biomonitoring and environmental assessment and those types of things within digital storytelling. The idea is that you're going to pull multiple methods together, multiple forms of data and knowledge together in a digital format to tell that story. Oftentimes when we say digital storytelling, there is also an element of actual storytelling. So it won't just be like the data and then the data is on a digital map and that's the story. Oftentimes there's going to be a conversation, like an oral history that's involved, where folks are talking about their individual experiences. And so back to the odor example, for example, if that's part of the process they want to use, so they give a whole history about the smell and how long it's been there and what it's meant for their community and why they decided to kind of finally like rise up and resist, right? Oral histories are a part of this conversation. One example that we lift up in this chapter in terms of an oral history approach is this idea of toxic bios, which are designed and intended to essentially push back on the narratives that are out there, right? And so much like counter mapping, this broader notion of counter narrative through counter storytelling is kind of what toxic bios gets at here, that there's going to be some narrative that's out there about a certain facility that is or is not causing harm, and to be able to center the voices of those experiencing that exposure to tell their bios, that their own oral history of that, to kind of disrupt that dominant, that hegemonic narrative is important. And as I just mentioned, this idea of counter storytelling is very fundamental to EJ work and involves various methods here, right? And so it could be a combination of gathering empirical data, air data, water data from various sources, right? Oftentimes it's going to be tied to a more developed story, right? So it might involve, an interview, videos, some digital mapping, some photography, as I'll get into in a second. But the idea is that we have to be able to reconcile that when we're talking about environmental justice, as Sarah said at the top, and as Chad and Martha have discussed with us throughout this process, just because we have this data, it's not going to like do the things by itself magically, right? We could have all the best data ever. All like if the burden of proof is on us, we can prove ourselves over and over and over and over again that there's something wrong here. But there's always going to be this tension, this inherent power dynamic, right? And oftentimes rooting ourselves in counter storytelling from the jump, serves us well in terms of understanding that this is going to be a matter of epistemic and recognition justice, as well as a matter of procedural justice. So choosing methods accordingly and our conceptual and theoretical orientation accordingly as well, right? So in terms of participatory media and community arts and photo voice, it's a lot here. It's probably too much for one little paragraph. I probably give a 20-minute talk on each of these, to be honest. So let's just go ahead through this real quick. So we lift up photo voice as a particular example. Sometimes folks consider it as a form of community art itself or participatory media. I would not necessarily disagree with that, but oftentimes when we say photo voice, we do mean a very distinct kind of discrete method. It involves using photography, whether it's cameras or smartphones, taking photos of a certain thing. For EJ communities, it might be, this an abandoned warehouse over here that we think might be leaking chemicals into the water or something of that nature, right? Or just vacant lots or tobacco environments or food environments, as we see quite a bit with the photo voice literature for environmental justice. Take the photos, narrate the photos, analyze those photos the photo narratives in terms of those broad themes. And the idea is to, take 7, 10, 12, 15, 20 folks and have them go through this process, participatory social documentary photography, essentially, and pull them together, have these conversations, and then share the data out. And the data here being the images themselves, the narratives to the image, like the stories that go along with it, right? So kind of again, a storytelling method. And then the broader things that come out and the action, the action demands and the claims that we would like to advance, right? One of my favorite methods, I use it quite a bit. And again, the range is kind of like, there's no limit to the range of EJ topics you could use photo voice with, right? And of course, combining that with other methods. As the chapter, we describe a few methods, including some of my own work and Johnson and colleagues, Jelks and colleagues as well, that we describe in the chapter, combining photography with participatory GIS and also, biomonitoring of air quality, right? Oftentimes is what you see in the EJ space. In terms of participatory media and community arts, other examples, use of video, use of theater. We mentioned, adapting aspects of theater of the oppressed to tell EJ stories, creation of zines that document things, right? So the inclusion of, hand-drawn maps and photographs and stories about what's going on in these communities, sometimes poetry, things of that nature. We'll move along here and then get into the last part of this. So big data and small data. So big data, it sounds like it is what it sounds like, right? It's big data, it's a lot of data. It's a lot of data from a lot of different sources, high volumes of data that can be analyzed, collected, and shared rapidly, right? So we think about most, EJ work, communicates EJ work. I wouldn't call it, I guess I would call it small data, but I also call it slow data. These community engaged research processes, they're intentional, they're deliberative. They move at a pace of, pace of like trust and rapport, essentially, oftentimes, right? But it's really premised upon, understanding a very localized, specific issue, oftentimes, right? With big data, because of the types of data that are available and the volume of it, and the pace at which this data can be collected and analyzed and shared, it opens up new possibilities for EJ scholars and community practitioners and community researchers to really tap into the power and the potential there, right? And one of the ways in which this we've seen this already in the EJ space is through this idea of crowdsourcing, where folks are kind of you're actively or passively collecting and sharing data from like a mobile device that gets uploaded to the cloud, and then that's in real time type of things, right? So we uplift and cite a couple examples of those studies in the chapter that I'll leave it to your own device to go and track those down. But the idea here is that it can be something that could be potentially instrumentally useful for us, especially if you think about larger scale exposures like air or water, things of that nature. But there's also some drawbacks that we lift up as well in the chapter, and namely this notion that was introduced by O'Neill, this idea of big data potentially being a weapon of math destruction, because oftentimes these data systems are premised upon algorithms, and if these algorithms are not necessarily cued in on the things that a particular community or a collective of communities is experiencing, it could end up leading to data omissions or data misrepresentations that might be fueling a policy conversation or an action conversation that might either be misplaced or have the propensity to cause even additional harm, right? Or oftentimes the algorithms might be configured in such a way that it deliberately obscures, EJ exposures through mismeasurement or the misrepresentation of the data, right? And so in response to some of these developments that have happened over the last decade or so, the notion of popular big data has been discussed. This idea, how can we render big data more inclusive and transparent and transformative for everyday people, right? And so, okay, big data is great. We don't all need to be like, out here coding things and collecting and analyzing things, but how can we be transparent about how that data is being used or not used, right? What types of data structures are there? Which types of kind of ethical concerns should we be focused on in terms of how we're going to try to engage with that form of data, right? And is it being used in a way that actually serves our immediate kind of lived embodied interests where we're located, right? I think that oftentimes as a public health person, we see a lot of studies that are taking data from all over the place. We have data from 50 states and we pull that sample. So you got people from 50 states, but then that raises questions about like the political actionability of that, because if you pull the sample and you have so much data, who is responsible for any of it if it's just going to be aggregated into such a large volume of data, right? And so I think it raises some questions about what are the potential valuable uses of big data in EJ work, and what are some of the ways in which it might end up taking up space in the EJ conversation that might not produce the most justice for our specific communities in the end. And then part of this conversation, that the pushback with big data too, has been this idea of environmental data justice to challenge the ways in which oftentimes large data sets and corporations and companies that have access to data tend to, as Vera and colleagues describe it, to structurally whitewashing environmental data. So the corollary to this, the other end of this, I guess, is this notion of small data, which I think the folks that have been in the EJ space for a while, and particularly in public health, will be familiar with this idea of popular epidemiology, developed by Phil Brown and colleagues. Basically, just like boots on the ground, like let's get out into the community and do our own thing. We'll rely on each other. We'll get some technical skills, and we'll go out, collect, and analyze our own data. We'll map our own data. Very specifically location, community-based type of work that has been, to my knowledge, around since the late 80s, early 90s. The notion of small data very much extends from that. And it's the idea that, you want to be able to do EJ work in a way that not only it allows for the broad range of methods we discussed, but really allows that control and that power of the data narrative and the data priorities to be controlled by those that are on the ground experiencing and embodying the things, right? I think too much of the EJ work that we've seen, I shouldn't say too much, but quite a bit of it that we've seen, particularly as a public health scholar, is folks that are sitting at a desk downloading data, downloading some data from the CDC or somewhere else, and analyzing things and finding correlations between air quality and respiratory health, and then publishing a study that's not really doing a whole lot, right? But to be able to actually take an approach that maybe it finds some of those sites and those locations where air exposures or water exposures are a concern, and really strategically tries to grow sustainable relationships to really center the voices of those that are experiencing those burdens to tell their own stories through a combination of methods here. And it can be some of the methods that you just download data. Sometimes that's useful. But I think the overarching aspect of this part of the, this book is that if we're serious about advancing procedural justice and distributive justice and recognition and epistemic justice, right? It's not just a matter of just casually coming up with a research question because you have curiosity. You really want to be able to center all these principles throughout the entire process. And oftentimes that means you have to start with what people actually want for themselves. What type of stories do they think would be most valuable? And how can we actually include and center those experiencing the exposures throughout the entire process? So not just looking at the data at the end, or not just helping us decide on the topic or anything like that, but how can we actually allow the most control for them throughout the entire process? And I'm going to stop right there because I'm pretty sure we're at time. And yep, it's a lot. Appreciate y'all.
Well, Ryan, if you want to go into your public health presentation, that would be great. We have about 17 minutes left. We're not getting a lot of Q&A, so take the time. Just leave us the last minute if you would to wrap up, but it's all yours.
Right. Okay. Let me get this.
While you're setting that up, I'll just let people know, because there was one question about whether this will be recorded. Yes, we're recording it. We'll email the link out to everybody. You can share it with other people as well. And you can also read the book because it's open access. You can download it for free.
Good. All right. Get it. Get it. Yep. So I guess I'll just continue right on into this next chapter. So Shout out to Dr. Rebanal who couldn't join us. We had a lot of fun working on this together. It was challenging, very challenging, and you'll understand in a minute when I get into the things here. It's a lot to cover. I mean, the methods was a lot to cover. Sarah and I really were like, you know what, like each of these could be a chapter, to be honest, but like we got them all in there. We hope we did a little bit of justice. And I think the same vibe applies to this chapter with David and I. Trying to figure out a way to just orient folks that are either new to this or have been connected to the field and to the work for a while, just something to as a starting point for the conversation, right? And of course, that comes with things that were included and excluded. We're not trying to start no fights. We don't want any beef. All we're trying to do is like we had some ideas, and so we put them together, and so this is what we got. So the overview. Yeah, the key thread for this, we wanted to basically try to write a chapter that just illustrated in some capacity the contributions of public health to community engaged research for environmental justice, all right? And then also outline some future directions. Myself and David, we started in public health practice. David has over 10 years of public health practice before getting into the academic and more thoroughly research space. Myself, I started as well in public health practice as well. And so for us, it was about, well, how can we take our own lived experiences as people who have lived in specific communities that had specific exposures, and then we got trained up to be practitioners, and now we're research scholars, and we're community engaged research collaborators, right? How can we just kind of create some type of thread that helps readers and learners think about some of the core things that have animated the work from our experiences and our particular orientations and lenses, right? So again, not trying to start no beef here about what is or what is not public health for EJ. But because of our practice experiences, David and I, we really felt we wanted to ground things in this 10 essential public health services, just because, there's like almost 3,000 local health departments in the US, and oftentimes that is the front line in terms of broad population health monitoring, with a lot of room for critique for that, but it's a conversation for another day. But it oftentimes is that's the agency that's going to be out here testing the water and monitoring the air and things of that nature, right? In addition to state health departments, of course. CBPR, community-based Pittsburgh research. I think folks on this webinar or watching this webinar will be more familiar with this, perhaps, than anything else that we'll talk about in this chapter. It's the core organizing body of work from my experience and my knowledge in public health that touches on EJ. Social epidemiology, as a social epi myself, David as well. A lot of things in social epi are touching on these social, political, and environmental structural things that are shaping our day-to-day exposures from like a broader level, right? And then when we engage CBPR, we're using that process and those principles to really zoom in on those locally embodied and experienced things, right? But the broader theoretical framework oftentimes for our field is shaped by the field of social epi. And within that, place health research is a subfield. And then, of course, in the practitioner space and also for researchers as well, the idea of health impact assessment. So those are the kind of 5 areas that we felt like really told the story best from our perspective and training. So I'll touch on those a little bit, and then I'll also outline ideas that we kind of pulled together about how public health as a field could actually show up and do more for folks that are in EJ communities to advance this work, right? I think that public health is not the only field that engages this work, right? There's chapters in this book that are from a planning perspective, from a legal perspective, from our policy perspectives. But as public health folks, we oftentimes feel like, it's a love-hate relationship with our field, right? And so we wanted to basically call in and call out aspects of our field that we felt like were kind of lacking and where we should be spending some more time and attention thinking critically about how we can advance the work of EJ. Just a reminder of these things here. I think that what I'm really going to emphasize through the rest of this part for public health is this idea of procedural and epistemic justice. So the 10 essential public health services, it's been around for decades. It recently got updated in 2020 to really center equity. So literally, and figuratively here in this image, equity it's a very popular word. I don't know if it means anything anymore in the ways in which I've seen it just thrown around, but the idea here is that you want to be able to build equity into all the processes that a health department does, right? But you'll notice that, there's no mention of these other structural things, systems of oppression and exclusion that really shape the presence or absence of equity, right? And so there's always going to be room for critique and limitations for this work, and that's something that we embedded into this chapter. But the idea is that David and I both came from public health backgrounds and practice backgrounds. And we thought it'd be a good launching point just to illustrate for readers, that assessing and monitoring population health, investigating and diagnosing things, communicating, all the things that we associate with doing EJ research are kind of already embedded in as routine, must have these functions for local health departments. Now, whether or not local health departments have the resources and the staff and the technical training, or the awareness or the passion or whatever else that you want to call it, to actually do this and do it in a way that's actually advancing change, that's a whole nother conversation. Because again, as I mentioned at the top when I started speaking, everything that we're doing for EJ is going to be tied to space. Space is contested. It's an inherently political aspect, right? Local health departments for public health practice, oftentimes we have this guise of being apolitical, detached, and neutral, let the data speak for itself. So we have to ask ourselves, is that the appropriate orientation if we really care about environmental justice, right? Because justice is not neutral. So moving on from there, we wanted to just give a shout out to the legacy of CBPR. So I will leave that to y'all to find in the chapter. But it's been around for a minute. That's one of the reasons I got into public health was discovering the history and the legacy of community-based participatory research in my training at Michigan with Barbara Israel, learning about Mary Meekler's work, Nina Wallerstein. Other folks that are out in the field and been holding this space for a long time, Dr. Rachel Morella-Frosch at Berkeley. I think that a large part of what I've been able to learn and kind of, get a grounding in for doing EJ work has come from this body of work in CBPR, right? And so I think various fields will call their version of community-based participatory research something else. That's why we're using this broader umbrella of CER, community engaged research, for this book. But it really is from my perspective, Chad and Martha, conversations we've had. A lot of the work that first environmental justice has come from the legacy of this work, right? And so I think it was really important that we wanted to lift that up and honor and center that in this chapter. What often isn't tied necessarily to the conversation of EJ is this idea of the field of social epidemiology. Again, David and I are social epis, and so we see the world through these lenses and these prisms. So folks that are out here doing this work might not be thinking of themselves as social epidemiologists or doing the work of social epi, but we can't unsee that, I guess, if that makes sense, right? And so I think that when we think about an environmental exposure, whether it's water or air or chemicals on the sofa, these are all tied to larger structures, right? And so you're talking about making a sofa that is sourcing materials from various places, and then there's transporting the materials, and then there's putting the chemicals on the sofa, right? Each one of these involves a larger macroeconomic, social, political structure, right, that is tied to space, right? The couch in the living room had to get made from some materials that were mined and gathered and put together, and they were shipped. And so there's an EJ trail throughout the entire process, right? So thinking broadly about the EJ exposures before they land upon our bodies is something that social epi is really, really attuned to, right? And of course, the exposures themselves are like kind of more closer to the outcome, the output, right? But all throughout that exposure trail, right, there's going to be matters of structural racism, gender inequality, sexism, and class inequality and intersectionality, right? And so myself and David, that's kind of how we see the EJ space, right? It's one thing to have the exposure, but as folks that live in EJ communities know, we know where the highways are going to go and not going to go. We know where the manufacturing facilities are located or not located. Oftentimes we know the extent of these things, how they intersect within fence line communities, right? And so social epi is really attuned to trying to understand and unpack and kind of disrupt those broader structures. When it gets to the part of landing on our bodies, social epis also contributed quite a few things, like the idea of allostatic load, the idea of weathering, the notion of embodiment, of course, life course health, right? This idea that our health, our EJ exposures don't just start with us, right? Our mothers embodied some chemicals that altered endocrine metabolic disruption, or epigenetic factors, right? That then carried on to another generation, right? And so social epi really helps us think about EJ exposures, not just being right here, right now, but also across the life course. Okay. Within social epi, again, David and I both consider ourselves place health researchers, neighborhood health researchers. And the idea is that, like I mentioned at the top, every environmental exposure occurs somewhere, right? And it occurs in multiple places over multiple time periods, right? And sometimes it's continuous. But the idea of place health research is trying to really understand what's going on within specific geographic, but also social, spatial element places, right? And so for us, it was important to lift up the ways in which neighborhood and place health research is also doing the work of EJ, oftentimes through community engaged research processes, right? So tobacco exposure and retail environments, food environments, green space, climate change, the examples that we cite in this chapter. Again, some of the work that's come out of Southern California and Atlanta, training youth and adults to basically go around and monitor air quality or take water sampling and doing participatory GIS and doing photo voice and integrating all these things for like digital storytelling, right? This is a very common thing that happens within the place health research literature, advancing EJ through a place health lens and perspective. And so for us, we felt like there's a lot for current students and future practitioners and scholars to really gather from the work that's unfolding within this subfield. And then health impact assessment. A lot of folks in the practitioner space will maybe be more familiar with this than folks in academic space. The idea is that when we are talking about environmental justice, we're oftentimes talking about measuring things that are already causing harm. They already exist. We're trying to remediate, repair, restore, disrupt, resist, right? The idea of health impact assessment is that we really should just be preempting some of these things, right? Like, why are we waiting until the thing is built and it's polluting our neighborhoods? Or why are we waiting until this policy gets passed and then it has this consequence, right? The idea of health impact assessment is to essentially do a process, screening and scoping, for example, to see what could potentially happen if we decide to pass a policy or implement some type of program, right? So that we can assess the potential harms from that in the front before we even go down that path, right? So you can imagine the value of this, right? Particularly like in enacting like this idea of the precautionary principle that people talk about environmental health so much, right? Like this is as precautionary as it gets oftentimes, right? And so it's had a lot of traction. It's taken off, especially since the 1999, I'd say early 2000s has really taken off. It's an extension of what folks might be familiar with, the environmental impact statement that's been required for large scale development projects. But the idea with health impact assessment is that you can use this process to assess literally any policy or program that a city council might be deliberating, that a state government might be deliberating federal policy. So transportation, housing, criminal justice, land use things, right? You want to change your zoning code. What are the consequences potentially for health and environmental justice if you change your zoning code to do a certain thing, right? It can be used for any of these things. And it has been, and we cite some examples in this chapter to give y'all a paper trail to follow up on. And so it has contributed quite a bit to advancing EJ work, particularly from a practitioner perspective. But oftentimes what happens is that these processes, these HIAs, as they're called, are initiated and often led by outside academic institutions, right? Such that the approximately 3,000 local health departments that I already mentioned, they're not necessarily the ones on the ground that are leading this process. Like they're the ones that are in the community every day. They're closest to the policymaking process for their government, right? But they're not necessarily the ones that are leading this process, right? So there's not necessarily the capacity to infrastructure to continuous, reliable resources to do these for every policy. So for example, when I was working in Baltimore, there might be 300 policies introduced in city council each year. No one has capacity to do 300 HIAs, but potentially there's a process that could be imagined in which the first couple of steps of HIA are applied to screen some of these policies earlier on, right? But to date, so far, it's been very limited in terms of the scale and the reach of how this is going to potentially preempt EJ harm. So in terms of how we might, re-envision, how we can move this work forward in public health, David and I really felt like with the growing conversation regarding anti-racism and decolonizing in public health, that it was interesting that like a lot of the work in the literature that we're seeing published, particularly in the academic space, is not really talking about decolonizing and anti-racism, right? Maybe they're assumed, maybe they're implied. But if you look at the curriculum for schools of public health and you look at the publication trends and things of that nature, it seems as if folks aren't really taking and engaging these things to the extent they really could be, right? If we're about promoting epistemic justice, distributive justice, procedural justice, right, transformative justice, that really requires a lot more of us in terms of how we think about our research methodologies and how we go about telling our EJ stories, right? And we just felt like there could be a lot more attention given to notions of public health critical race praxis, but also themes related to misrepresentation that Linda Smith, the colonial scholar, talks about, the ways in which our communities, if left to some other data narrative, some other, researcher, that's going to try to misrepresent our communities, but do an injustice to us and epistemic harm to us, right? How can we try to do better about preempting that to offer counter narratives, essentially? But then also the idea of commodification of knowledges, right? Linda Smith talks about this idea of how local and indigenous knowledges, community knowledges, are oftentimes, they're extracted, and passed off as somebody else's knowledge, and then they commodify that knowledge, right? They publish a paper, they get another grant for their university, right? And none of that grant money, none of the F&A, that fiscal administrative, comes back to the community where the knowledge was kind of extracted from, right? So how can we do a better job at that? Because in terms of distributed justice, we have to ask ourselves, if we're doing this work and we're getting large federal grants and they're going to our university, and our university is taking 50% in fiscal administrative fees, and they could use whatever they want to do. They can do whatever they want with that 50%, right? Maybe it's, $5 million of a $10 million grant. What are they, are they using that $5 million to advance EJ? Are they what are they doing with that, right? That's a $5 million immediate benefit for an institution, but how is the research actually benefiting, right? Maybe that $5 million should just go into I'm just saying. I'm not trying to start no fights, but this is what we're talking about in terms of applying decolonial anti-racist practices, right? These relations of power in terms of distributed justice and who benefits immediately and tangibly from our work, they need to be reconciled, they need to be challenged. Another idea we want to lift up was this idea of centering power in placemaking. Oftentimes, a lot of the work for EJ is cross-sectional. Like the folks that live in the community, they have the history, they have the longitudinal exposure, multiple generations, right? But with our research, we just pop in and pop out, and it's cross-sectional. Even sometimes with community-engaged research, right? We might do a project for 1 or 2 years, and that's it. And then we do that project, and we don't situate it in this historical context, and we don't name the power structures that created that context, right? And so we're kind of incapable of using our research to disrupt those power dynamics because we didn't even recognize or acknowledge or map out literally or figuratively those power dynamics that shape that EJ exposure. And so something that's been from our read been missing from a lot of the literature on EJ in the public health space. And then the last piece is reimagining what counts as environmental. I have to say that as much as EJ literature has focused on necessarily communities are at the margin, one margin or another, right? It's amazing how we have continued to do environmental work and EJ work that perpetually focus on the deficits and the harms. Now, obviously, we have to address those harms and we need that type of research, but our environments on a daily basis are more than just the things that are harming us and causing us pain, right? And so we really thought it would be great for EJ scholars and community engaged researchers to really think about how we can start including positive exposures, places of joy and inclusion, love and healing and resistance, right? Not everything that's going on in EJ communities with harmful exposures is harmful, right? And so why is our EJ work so focused on finding that pain and that damage, right? Eve talks about suspending narratives of damage, right? Black feminist geographer Catherine McKittrick talks about, this notion that the Black geographic peril, right? Like every time you see data about a neighborhood, it's it's falling apart, right? It's is that the only way in which we can represent or do epistemic justice to EJ community is by focusing on the harms all the time? And then in terms of specific areas that we thought would be that warrant more attention, policing. We mentioned it in the book. I encourage you to reflect and read on that. Policing and state surveillance and carcerality everywhere. They're embedded everywhere in U.S. society, right? For people of color, for folks in the trans community, folks from various identities and social locations that are strategically, systematically marginalized, right? The policing, the surveillance never leaves, right? Everywhere we go, that's an exposure. We talk about allostatic load, we talk about stress, right? How come we're not talking about that as an EJ exposure? We believe that is an area that deserves more attention. Also, the idea of spatial stigma, the ways in which we tell stories about space and place create stigma about those places, and that can itself be a stressor. The notion of white space, and so we've seen quite a bit of things happen in academic space for Black women in the recent months. It's a burden, it's an exposure to be a person of color, a woman of color, especially in predominantly white spaces, right? How can we think about spaces of work, spaces of place, school spaces, and the potential harms of being in that space as a type of exposure, right? And then lifting up and really trying to see more work that focuses on indigenous lands and spatial healing, right? And again, like not everything that we talk about within EJ communities needs to be focused on the harms. Sometimes the environmental exposure is like the healing elements of it, right? And how can we do EJ work that's focused on harms to remediate and repair so that we can heal? But then also, how can we lift up stories that are in and of themselves going to be conducive to healing? Okay, so covered a lot there. Might have gone over time, but I mean, can you blame me? No, I mean, that could have been like 4 or 5 chapters. So leave you with this quote, and then I think we'll probably have some questions.
Huge thanks to Sarah, to David, and Ryan, who, as you can see, we leaned on very heavily in this book because he was the lead author on 2 chapters. So really, really grateful for all the contributions that co-authors made to the book. And I think you got a sense from the presentations today just how rich the chapters are. I think Martha's going to share a screen just with our last slide here, just to remind you that we have some additional webinars that are coming up. So we encourage you to come to the one, register for the ones on March 1 and March 7. You can see the QR code, or you can find those online. Encourage you to download the chapters. If you have students, think about assigning them to your students. And if you have questions that you didn't get a chance to ask today, please feel free to email them to any of us. We'll be sure to pass them along and make sure that they get to where they need to go. Thank you again so much to the presenters, and special thanks from me to Martha for agreeing to work on this book with me for the past 3.5 years. Hope to see you on March 1st and March 7th. Until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe out there.